Okay, well, it's already been said. I'm Dave, and I've been asked to do the next in our series of Will the Real Jesus Stand Up, when we're steadily working through a passage in Luke and have reached the bit which talks about setting the oppressed free. To remind ourselves of the complete scripture, which is on the next slide. Can we go? Yeah, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And so the line for this week is to set at liberty those who are oppressed. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Rachel was preaching on the earlier line of deliverance from the captives, and she said this was quite linked with the later one of liberty here. And she looked at it in one sense from a very personal sense of how it had worked out in her own life. As it's good to have a contrast, I'm not going to be personal. I'm going to go into, well, what does actually liberty mean, and what does oppression mean? Now, I don't want to finish with oppression. It sounds rather depressing. So we better start with oppression and then work on to liberty. All right? Does that sound a better arrangement to you? So, what does oppression mean? Well, let's think about Jesus' time. And what many people would have thought about then was the Roman occupying the land. But when you look at Jesus, he doesn't seem that worried about the Romans. He goes and does things like heals the servant of the centurion. He seems almost quite happy to walk into the centurion's house. That doesn't seem to be the kind of oppression that he's worried about. So let's look back into the Old Testament and see what the Old Testament said was really oppression. So, on the next slide, hopefully, we've got a passage that comes from Leviticus, which talks about oppression and what oppression is. Now, we haven't yet got the next slide. Okay. It talks about the social background for oppression. I'm sure we'll get the next slide shortly. There it is. You start reading this and see how social it is. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. It's very, very social. It's related not to an occupying army, but how we deal with each other. It's not our friends who are the test, it's the difficult people. And I sort of rather suspect that most of us have got people who we find to be just a little bit difficult. We just don't quite really manage to talk on the same wavelength as them or something like that. And this passage sort of puts it in context. How even-handed are we towards them? Or do we drift into becoming an oppressor towards them? Because it's how we treat our brothers and sisters that says whether or not they're oppressed. And it goes a bit beyond that. There's a similar passage, which I haven't put on the slide, in Exodus 23. And it includes the rather interesting line. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him. So here's this guy who you definitely don't get on with because he hates you. And he's got a problem. And it's your duty to go and help him. And if you don't, then that's kind of scripture is almost labeling you as an oppressor. Now, I'm not really sure what the 21st century equivalent of a donkey lying under its burden really is. It could be all kinds of things. But it sort of puts the whole thing at saying, actually, sometimes this can come down to very practical things that just sort of happen. And, all right, we have over recent months had a whole series of sermons on identifying oppression and challenging us to deal with it. Topics like toxic masculinity, purity culture, racism, classism. You know, there's been a lot said there. Have we taken it on board? Are we living in the good of that and saying, I want my life to be one that makes other people wholesome, full of what they can be in God. I want it to be free of any trace of oppression. I was privileged enough a few weeks ago to go and see the local production of Godspell. And I guess a few of us went and saw it. And one of the things that they acted out there was the parable of Jesus on the unforgiving servant. You remember where this servant owed his master massive amounts of money and got forgiven, and then went and threw a fellow servant who owed him a little bit into prison. We cannot afford to be that kind of servant. We have to be open-hearted. We have to make sure we're as free as we possibly can of oppressing one another. But let's move on to the other theme, that of liberty. And on this, I want to start with what I think was probably a unique celebration in Israel, the year of Jubilee. And that's described in Leviticus 25. Sound the ram's horn all over the land. Sanctify the 50th year. Make it a holy year. Proclaim freedom over all the land to everyone who lives in it. A jubilee for you. And so it goes on telling how anybody who'd sold their land, it came back to them in that 50th year. And if they'd been so unfortunate as to end up into slavery, then they were released with their whole family. It was a tremendous readjustment. And this, of course, has often been interpreted as being as Jesus fulfilling this and setting us free. And that's been celebrated in many, many different songs. And I can remember Charles Wesley one that goes, "This is the year of Jubilee." Sorry, that's the wrong one. "Blow ye the trumpet, blow, the gladly solemn sound. Let all the nations know, to earth's remotest bound, the year of Jubilee is come. Return ye ransomed sinners home." And the other one I got misquoted because on my notes, and I swapped them around the wrong way. That was about the 1970s. "This is the year of Jubilee, when all the captives are set free. Come ye halt ye blind ye lame, leap and shout for joy again. This is the year of Jubilee." It's our inheritance to be free. It's our inheritance that we cannot, in one sense, lose. We might lose it for a time, but our inheritance is that we are free. We are the children of God, and we have the rights under that. Now, I can point out as well, this, again, like oppression, is a social context. As oppression, we talked about relationships. Here again, it's the relationships of you and the community around you. But we also ought to pick up the other side of this. What if you've had some servants for the last 20 years and the year of Jubilee comes? and you have to set them free. What's going to happen to your lifestyle? Would a pragmatic theology overrule what the Scripture says? You know, would the oppressors, in that sense, not want to have this year of Jubilee because it costs too much? If we're the oppressors, do we actually want a Jubilee that frees everybody? You know, one of the things we may have to face up to over coming years as a nation is the times when we've oppressed other nations, when this nation is still one of the rich nations of the world. And what does that mean in terms of what we should be doing for others? Let's go back to trying to work it out and what happened. Because the people of Israel didn't always manage to do it, and Jeremiah objected to one thing at one stage. We'll have the next slide. It gives a little bit of the background of what happened in Jeremiah's time. So next slide. King Zedekiah, he did quite well at times, and he arranged for this declaration of freedom. But then they broke their promises and forced their former slaves to become slaves again. Then Jeremiah received this message from God. On the next slide, you can hear something, I hope, of the fury of Jeremiah and the fury of God through Jeremiah. And now you, what have you done? First you turned back to the right way and did the right things, decreeing freedom for your brothers and sisters, and you made it official in a solemn covenant in my temple. And then you turned right around and broke your word, making a mockery of both me and the covenant, and made them all slaves again. These men and women you just set free. You forced them back into slavery. Quite strong. But he probably needed to be. Well, I want us to consider, how is it possible to make freed people slaves again? It happened then. And you think at first sight, well, how is it possible? But actually, unfortunately, it is often all too easy to be taken back into slavery. This gets shown in things like battered wives who stay with their abusive partners. It's still true that in the south of the United States, there's a lot of oppression, basically, towards the blacks who used to be the slaves. And it's not limited to there. A couple of years ago, we had our black brother, Deo, come and tell us about what it was like living as a black person in the UK and the times when they had to take special treatment because otherwise they were at risk. I'm sure that Chris could tell various things from South Africa and the abolishing of apartheid there and the follow-on from that and how deep such things can run. Why is this important to us? It's because since Jesus came to set us free, we need to live in that freedom. We need to grasp hold of what Jesus has actually done in setting us free and say, I'm going to live in the fullness of what I am called to be. How do we do that? Well, I ain't got a magic wand to wave over you and to make it all happen. But I have got some pointers on the next slide. I say they're only pointers. They're not a prescription. But the first one is security in God. Next slide. You are accepted. And this again links onto an awful lot of ministry we've had over recent months. I am who you say I am, we sing. You need to become confident in what God has said over you. You need to know that it is actually true. You are a child of God. And that makes you royalty. That makes you somebody with rights. Somebody who can lift your head up high. Who can say, I am the son of a king, the daughter of a king. I don't need to be ashamed of who I am. I am redeemed. I may have had all kinds of past, but I am redeemed. In many ways, use your quads on this kind of thing. Ask in your quads, how well do you live in your security in God? Because you can talk about such things, hopefully your quads reach the stage where you've got quite a good trust for each other and can share things. And that in such an area you can easily say and be open about, well, how secure really am I? All right, next point. Next slide. Quote from Timothy, training in godliness. Now when you actually look in 1 Timothy 4, this almost just stands by itself. It doesn't give any kind of explanation of what that actually means. But other passages do give quite a lot of guidance. We do need to gain skills in order to be all that we should be. Let me give you a completely silly example that's totally, in one sense, unspiritual. Imagine a baby arguing against potty training. We won't worry about the fact that babies can't argue. Let's just consider a baby arguing against potty training and saying, well, I quite like the freedom to be able to wander around and do whatever. And, why should I have to go and hunt out a potty? And well, I quite enjoy Mummy and Daddy looking after me and changing my nappy and such like. And there is a sort of logic there, isn't there? But if you didn't do potty training, what do you think would be the results when that little baby had grown up to be a teenager and was still wearing nappies? Might be rather troublesome. And you train the baby to be potty trained so that they have the resources to be the person they need to be later. And the same is true with training in godliness. We do discipline ourselves and at times receive disciplines from others to train ourselves in godliness, to train ourselves into ways which are going to serve us in good stead as we go onwards in God. So, when Chris starts talking of 5 disciplines, don't react too much. It's part of this. It's part of trying to ensure that we actually do have the character to live in our freedom. Okay, next point, responsibility. With freedom comes responsibility. Now, probably the best way to illustrate this is on the next slide, which is an extract from Galatians. Christian brothers, you were chosen to be free. Be careful that you do not please your old selves by sinning because you are free. Live this free life by loving and helping others. You obey the whole law when you do this one thing. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. But if you hurt and make it hard for each other, watch out, or you may be destroyed by each other. in one sense, I don't think I've got much more to say on that. Watch out that you don't get destroyed by one another. Care for each other. So we need to possibly go on and say, well, what does this freedom look like? This loving and helping others. So let's address that a little bit. Go back to Jesus under the Roman occupation, and as far as I'm aware, the one instruction he gave about interacting with the occupying force, which occurs in Matthew 5 on the next slide. Now we're in the middle of that passage. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Now, apparently this forcing of people to do things by the occupying forces dates back to the Persians. But the mile apparently is the Roman mile. I think it's 1,000 status, and so it was clearly relating in that sense to the Romans. And you might remember that one of Jesus' 12 disciples, 12 apostles, was a zealot. Now, what do you think the zealots thought about taking the burden of a Roman soldier for a mile? I think they'd almost rather die than do that. And here's Jesus saying, don't just do it, do double it. And then he's saying, if someone would sue you and take your coat, let him have your cloak also. If someone begs from you, do not refuse him. What kind of logic is this? The answer to that is it's the logic of the kingdom of heaven. It's the logic of knowing where you sit in Jesus, where your life is hid. Do you believe that God who clothes the lilies of the fields is able to clothe you? To the point where your coat and cloak are not particularly important. God can replace those. Do you believe to the point where, right, if someone else needs money, it's available? I've a couple of friends who, at one time, both of them used to live on the streets. And both of them have now actually got flats and places to live. But periodically, they send me messages and say, please, can you send me some money for food? And I always do. In one sense, it's a response to this scripture. It's also a response to how far they've come. It is a tremendous journey for people who've been used to living on the streets to manage to hold down a flat. On the streets, you have no need to save up for regular bills. To actually make that transition and be able to cope is a tremendous step. I want to support the tremendous steps they've made. And the amount of money it costs me is not significant. Give to him who begs from you. So, it's a challenge to live with a kingdom vision. Looking at what's important when I'm an eternal child of God, when my actual home is in heaven, when the things of this earth are not important to me. And I reckon Paul went an awful long way on this. Next slide is an extract from one of the things he says. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. And he had quite a few of those. And yet he could say that. I'm content with those for the sake of serving Christ. And give you a quote from Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian who ended up being executed by the Nazis in the closing days of the Second World War. And he says, "It is not some religious act which makes a Christian what he is, but participating in the sufferings of God in the life of the world." It is not some religious act which makes a Christian what he is, but participating in the suffering of God in the life of the world. So Paul, in another scripture, expounds this a bit further. Next slide. We are treated as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet well known, as dying and behold we live, as punished and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing everything. Our mouth is open to you, O Corinthians. Our heart is wide. You're not restricted by us, but you're restricted in your own affections. In return, I speak as to children. Widen your hearts also. And basically, I want to conclude here, to leave you with a vision of what liberty in Jesus could look like, where you're so in love with God and longing for his fullness that the only use of things of this earth, including your life, your strength, is to spread his love and his life. Where your heart is unrestrained in loving as Jesus loved, where you cannot but delight in all the fellow creatures God has made. I'm not there, but I've seen something of that possibility. I want it. Let's see how far we can go along in doing good to one another, in making this happen.